Hi, I'm JJ and this is Buckhorn Supply Co. This is my very first YouTube tutorial, and the bag that I'm making for this tutorial is the Crafters Carry-All Tote by Kandou Crafts. So this is a very new pattern. It came out the 2nd of January, and it is a great bag for knitters, crocheters, really anybody who likes to carry around their project with them. Some features of this bag include this notion pouch on the front pocket here. This removes, and then you just have this extra bag that you can put your things into. And then it just snaps right back in place. There's also some slots for knitting needles, pens if you want to put pens. I did add a modification to the back where I added a snap closure onto the back. This is not a part of the pattern, but if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask. Another modification I made are strap holders, because I made a strap. This bag is for a friend of mine who is a mom and needs to just be able to grab and go, so I added that. However, there are other modifications that are built into the pattern itself, like the handles. I opted for riveted handles, but there are options for webbing handles as well as fabric handles. There is also an option for a zipper closure instead of the drawstring closure. I love the drawstring closure, especially for not getting string and things hung up on it. And then this is such a spacious bag. This is great if you have huge projects like a sweater or a blanket. There is a smaller version as well, but we went with a large version because my friend that knits, she has large projects. So I want her to be able to carry all of the things. So if you're interested in learning how to make the Crafters Carry-All Tote from Kandou Crafts, follow along. I am doing the large size bag. So for the large size bag, you are going to need a 1/2 yard of the contrast fabric, and I'm using this floral exterior fabric. Then you'll need 1.25 yards for the main exterior fabric, and I'm using this dark denim. Some additional fabric you're going to need is 3 yards for the lining fabric. This is also going to include the drawstring section. As you can see, my lining has words, so we're going to pay attention to the direction of it. You're also going to need 1 fat quarter for the base as well as the notion pouch. For my base, I'm using this faux leather vinyl. I did end up using real leather for the notion pouch itself. For interfacing, you are going to need 1 yard of fusible fleece. You're also going to need some SF101, 2.5 yards of that, and then you're going to need some harder interfacing like Peltex. I ran out of SF101, so I used fusible fleece a lot. Here are the additional materials you're going to need to finish this bag. You're going to need a rivet set if you are doing the leather strap option. I'm doing the leather strap option. There's also directions for a webbing tape option. You are also going to need buttons or snaps. This is for the notion pouch. You're going to need drawstring cord. You're also going to need purse feet if that's what you want to add. And then if you're using a bag tag, you're going to want that as well. I'm using this concho. The pattern comes with these handy tags that you can use to mark your pieces once you've cut them out. This is piece A, my main panel, and I'm using this dark denim, which is already interfaced on the inside at 1/2 inch from the raw edge. The pattern itself has a dotted line that you'll want to pay attention to, and that's where you'll cut your interfacing at. The lining piece is also a piece A, but it has a specific line that you want to pay attention to for when you're cutting. My fabric is directional, so I do want to pay attention to that direction that the words are facing. The lining is interfaced with SF101 per the manufacturer's instructions. And I like to interface all of my quilting cotton with SF101. For piece B, which is the pocket piece fabric, you will have 2 exterior contrast fabrics as well as 6 lining fabrics. Piece C is the base of the bag, and I am using this faux leather vinyl, and it will be interfaced with Peltex. Piece D is going to be the facing, and this is what connects the drawstring and lining to the main bag. Piece E is the drawstring piece, and I ended up fusing this with fusible fleece since I ran out of SF101. Starting with the base that should already be interfaced, we are going to take the long edges and fold it wrong sides together. You're going to fold in about 1/2 inch, at least to where that harder interfacing is. Now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and top stitch along the long edge at 1/8 of an inch. Remember to back stitch every time you start and stop. If you were planning on adding purse feet, now is the time to do it. I use the pattern itself to mark where the bag feet go. There is instructions on how to measure where the bag feet go in order to insert them. How you attach your bag feet will be dependent on the type of bag feet that you have. I like to use duct tape to cover over the metal part. The instructions call for you to interface it, but I like to use duct tape. Now we're going to set our base aside. Working on front pocket piece B, we are going to measure 2.5 inches down from the raw edge to set our snap. You're going to interface that, and if you're going to do a bag tag, now is the time to interface that as well. I'm adding a concho instead of a bag tag, so I'm adding this at 2.5 inches from the bottom raw edge and centered with the snap for the notion pouch. Once your bag tag is in place and your dot is marked for where the snap is going to go for your notion pouch, you're going to take a piece of lining and face it right sides together with that front pocket piece. And I have directional fabric, so I'm just making sure that the fabric is the direction that I want it to be at before I clip the top raw edge. Now you're going to take that over to your sewing machine and you are going to sew along that clipped raw edge at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once that top seam is stitched, you are going to take this and fold it wrong sides together, and you are going to clip around the sides and the bottom raw edge. Starting at the top right corner, we are going to sew down the short edge, then down the long edge, and back up the short edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance. You are going to do this for both the front and back pocket pieces. Now that the side seams are stitched, you are going to top stitch along the top edge. I top stitched at 1/4 inch seam allowance with a 3.5 millimeter stitch length. Now we are going to mark and draw our lines for the pocket divisions on our pocket pieces. You're going to want to find the midpoint on both of your pocket pieces. I do that by folding them in half and then marking the center. I do want to note that you really want to pay attention to the front panel when you're drawing your lines and ensuring that that center pocket is at least 8.5 inches wide. This is the pocket that is going to hold your notion pouch, and you want to make sure that it's large enough to hold the notion pouch. Now we're going to assemble the main panels by laying the front panel A right side up and place the front pocket piece also right side up on top of it, aligning the side and bottom edges. Then you're going to clip the pieces together and do this for both panel pieces. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine and attach the front pocket pieces to the panels by sewing down the side, across the bottom, and back up the side at 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to do this for both panel pieces. Now we're going to stitch the pocket division lines. Starting with the front panel, you're going to begin at the bottom edge of the pocket piece, stitch up precisely on the line. You're going to take a couple stitches at the top, then come down 1/8 inch from the stitch line. When it comes to the center pocket where your notion pouch is going to be, you're going to want to stitch precisely on the line and then stitch out towards the outer edge and then back down. You want to make sure you're doing that on both sides of that center notion pocket. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and again, you're going to stitch precisely on the line, take a couple stitches at the top, and then go back down about 1/8 away from the original stitch line. I did mine at about the width of my foot because I like how thick the lines look. Again, we want to pay attention to that center notion pocket that we are going to stitch precisely on the line and then go outward towards the raw edge instead of inward towards the notion pocket. And you're going to do that on both sides of the notion pocket. Then you're going to finish your stitches and then do the same thing on the back panel as well. Here's what that panel is going to look like. Again, my stitching is a little bit wider than 1/8. I just like the look of this. And my stitch length is about a 3.5. There are various options for handles. You can either go with a shoulder strap or a short carry handle. And there's also instructions for leather straps or webbing straps. I went with a leather carry handle option, so I will be riveting these to my bag. At this step is when I also set the snap for the notion pouch. Once your handles are installed, you are going to take your main panels and face them right side together. Then you're going to align the bottom edge and the side edges of both pieces and clip the panels together. Then you're going to take this over to your sewing machine and stitch along the base at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to back stitch when you start and stop. Then you're going to cut the corners of the base to reduce bulk in the seam. Open the piece up and lay it out flat. I like to use my roller to reduce the bulk in the seam a little bit more by pressing the seam open. And take a piece of double-sided tape and run it along the center seam and along both raw edges. Place the base on top, right side is up, right on top of that center seam, and the sides should overlap the bottom edges of the pocket pieces. We're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch up the length right on top of our stitches. Then we're going to stitch across the raw edge at 1/4 inch, back down the length again on top of our stitches and back across. Again, you're going to stitch directly on top of your stitches on the long edge and then 1/4 inch seam allowance on the raw short edge all the way around. Continuing with the assembly, you're going to fold the pieces right sides together and align the top and sides before clipping the sides. You want to pay attention to the pocket pieces and make sure that those are lined up as well. Once both sides are clipped, you're going to take that over to your sewing machine and use 1/2 inch seam allowance and stitch both side seams end to end. Make sure you back stitch at the start and end. I also like to add a couple stitches right where the pocket pieces are. You're going to sew both sides at 1/2 inch seam allowance. When we're done stitching those side seams, we are going to clip the corners of the sides at both the top and bottom. You're also going to want to press or roll out the side seams. With the side seams pressed open, we are going to close our base corners by opening up the bottom and aligning the bottom ends of the side seams with the end of the base seams. And you're going to clip that together at the raw edge. The instructions give a tip to use a ruler to draw a line at 1/2 inch seam allowance before stitching to ensure that the base is exactly the same length on both sides. You're going to stitch directly on the line that you drew, making sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the end. Depending on the materials that you're using for your bag, you will want to go slow in this section because of the bulk. I did end up hand cranking over the center seam because it's a bit bulky right there and I didn't want to break a needle. Now it's time to flip the bag right side out. You're going to want to work on those corners and use your finger to push the base out. Now is a good time to trim up any loose threads that you might see. If the corners are uneven or you see any puckers in the fabric, flip it back out and stitch it again. I did rivet on some tabs with some D-rings so that you can attach a longer shoulder strap. This is not a part of the original pattern, so if you have any questions about that, send me a message or leave me a comment. Now it's time to work on the lining, starting with the interior pockets. I chose to use my contrast fabric as well as my lining fabric for the pockets. You should have 4 remaining pieces of the pocket lining, and we are going to trim 1 inch from the top edge of these pieces. Once all 4 pieces are cut, you're going to put the pieces right side together. I'm pairing a contrast piece with a lining piece. You're going to clip those together and you're going to take it over to your sewing machine and sew along the long edges at 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're going to do this for both pieces. Now you're going to put your hand in between the pieces and pull it right side out. Once both pieces are right side out, go ahead and press it. You're going to take a ruler and a fabric marker and mark the position for the pocket divisions by drawing lines from the top to the bottom edges. I'm drawing these at 3 1/4 inch from the side edge. That's the instructions for the large bag. Once your lines are drawn, we are going to assemble the lining panels by laying lining panel A right side up and placing one of the pocket pieces on top, also right side up. You want to pay attention to the instructions because it calls for you to place the pocket lining 1 inch above these corners. Once you have everything lined up, you're going to clip it in place and take it over to your sewing machine and sew the edges and the division lines. We're going to sew this exactly like how we sewed the front panels by sewing up the line, coming out a couple stitches, and then sewing back down. Using 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to stitch down the side, across the bottom edge, and up the second side of the pocket piece. Working on the division lines, you're going to start from the bottom, stitch precisely on the line all the way to the top of the pocket, take a couple stitches at the top, and come back down about 1/8 of an inch away from your original stitch line. Again, mine is about as wide as my foot because I like the look of that. You're going to do this for both pocket pieces. With the pocket division complete, you are now going to join the front and back lining panels by placing both lining panels right side together. You'll want to make sure that you line up right at the pocket pieces before clipping. Clip both side seams together as well as the bottom. Using 1/2 inch seam allowance, you're going to stitch both side seams end to end. You're also going to stitch the base from the edge inward an inch, making sure to leave the central section open so that you can turn the bag out later. Again, you're going to stitch the side seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Backstitch at the beginning and the end. I also backstitch where the pocket pieces are. You're also going to stitch the base, starting at the edge, coming inward 1 inch, and leaving the center part open for turning the bag out. You're also going to close the bottom corners using the same method that we used to close the bottom corners of the exterior piece. So by putting the side seams together with the edges of the base. You're going to measure this again, similar to how we did the exterior pieces, measuring at a 1/2 inch to make sure that the fit is correct. So directly on the line, backstitching at the beginning and the end. You're going to make the drawstring section by taking one drawstring E and laying it wrong side up. I laid mine right side up because I have directional fabric and I really want to make sure it's facing the right direction. I'm using the template as a guide in order to make our start and stop points. Using a pen, I'm going to mark the start and stop point on both the bottom and top part of the drawstring. Once you have the start and stop points marked, you're going to place both drawstring pieces right side together, aligning the edges and clipping down the side edges. You're going to stitch down the side edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure to stop and start at those dots. You're going to take this over to your sewing machine and stitch at 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down to that stop point. Make sure you backstitch a couple stitches before lifting your foot up and moving to the start point. Make sure to backstitch when you start again. Then continue all the way down the side before doing the same exact thing on the other side seam. With these side seams stitched, you are now going to snip into the seam allowance 1 inch above the stop point and 1 inch below the start point. And you're going to do that for both sides. Now you're going to open up the drawstring piece so that you can press the side seams, making sure that you press that open section back at least 1/2 inch. Working on the open section, you're going to take one side and fold it inward. I used my iron to press this little fold down before I flipped the raw edge underneath into the seam allowance. Then you're going to pin this in place. You'll want to lift up on the fabric a little bit just to make sure you're not catching the fabric underneath. You're going to do this on both sides of that open seam before flipping this over and doing the same thing on the other side. Once all of your opening sections have the raw edges pinned down, you're going to take this over to your sewing machine and sew around the opening at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, just to note, when you're sewing this, the fabric is right sides together, so you want to make sure that you pull the bottom fabric underneath and that there is no additional fabric underneath your foot. So I'm sewing this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance in a rectangle around this opening here, pulling the pins as I go, and then back stitching when I get to the top seams. This opening here is where your drawstrings are going to come out of, so you really want to reinforce this a little bit. I went really slow in this section, and I also went around one more time just to make sure that I'm really getting this stitched down. You'll want to keep checking with your fingers so there's no additional fabric underneath, just to make sure that you're not stitching the other side in this opening. Now you're going to do the same thing to the other opening. When you're done stitching both openings, it should look like this. We're going to fold the pieces in two wrong sides together by bringing the top edge down to meet the bottom edge, and you're going to align both the raw edges and clip it together. If you have directional fabric, right now you want to take a pause and look at your fabric with the raw edge down and make sure it is facing the direction you want it to. Mine is not, so I'm going to flip this inside out. That way the words are readable if you're looking on the outside of the bag. Now that my drawstring is the correct direction, I'm also going to clip the top here so that I can top stitch at 1 inch from the top edge. This is going to create the channel for our drawstring. Sew the bottom raw edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance, then top stitch the top 1 inch away from the edge. I'm starting with the raw edge here, and I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to go all the way around, back stitching when you start and end. Just make sure to keep moving the fabric so that you can go in a continuous loop. Now we're going to work on the top edge. I'm using a seam guide to help me stay at 1 inch. The instructions call for you to stitch slightly below the opening, but I will show you how I did mine. So I stitched directly up to the stitches from when we sewed the opening closed. Stop and pivot and sew directly on those stitches down to the base, across the base, and then back up to that inch line. I then stop and pivot again and reset my seam guide before I continue around the top. I do the same exact thing on the other opening as well. Now our channel for our drawstring is complete. We're going to attach the drawstring section to the lining by laying the bag lining right side out. You're then going to take the drawstring section and turn it upside down so that the raw edge is upward. Then you're going to place the lining inside of the drawstring section, making sure to align the side seams before clipping all the way around. You're going to sew this all the way around at 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. Prep the facing pieces by placing both facing pieces right side together and aligning the edges before clipping these short side edges. Stitch the side edges at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim the corners of the seam allowance to reduce bulk. With the facing wrong side out, you're going to slip it over the drawstring piece, lining up the side seams and clip into place. Then you're going to reach inside and flip this wrong side out so that you can stitch the facing in place at 1/2 inch seam allowance all around the inside. You're going to want to go slow around the side seams just due to the bulk, especially depending on the fabric that you use. You might need to adjust the fabric as you're working and keep it pulled taut so that there isn't any wrinkles or bulging that happens in any spots. With that facing done, now it's time to assemble our bag. You're going to want your lining wrong side out and the exterior bag right side out. Tuck the handles into the pockets to keep them out of the way. Now you're going to take the lining piece and flip the facing outward so that it's sticking up outside of the lining. Now you're going to take the exterior bag and place it inside of the lining so that both pieces are right side together. You're going to line up the side seam before clipping the facing to the top of the exterior bag. You may need to work your fabric a little bit to get this all lined up and nice and tight. Keep adjusting if you need to. I used a ton of clips in this section. We're going to stitch using 1/2 inch seam allowance all around the top edge, stitching on the lining side. You're going to want to go really slow around the handles and kind of use your fingers to push the handles out of the way to make sure it doesn't get caught up in your needle. Go slow around the side seams because these are really bulky sections. If you need to, hand crank it and just go slow. I did backstitch a couple times over the side seam just to reinforce it a little. Now we're going to turn the bag right side out using that opening that we had left in the lining. Place your hand through the opening and grab the bottom of the exterior. You're going to pull that down while slowly rolling the lining upward. Keep working the lining upward until you have the exterior completely out, then work on straightening out the lining piece. I like to use this time to trim up any thread that I see and kind of clean up the outside a little bit. Now you're going to pull the lining all the way out of the bag so that you can close the base of the lining. To close the base of the lining, you're going to work on this opening section and you're going to take one piece of the opening and fold it wrong side together. Once each side is folded wrong side together, you're going to pair those up right side together and clip. Now stitch that closed at 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching when you start and end. Now the lining's closed up, you're going to push the entire lining back into the bag, working on the corners so that they're nice and tucked into the exterior of the bag. Now you're going to ease the top seam by rolling it between your thumb and your finger, trying to get it nice and even before pressing. I added some clips just to make sure that everything was in place for top stitching. You might want to swap your foot to a zipper foot or a thinner foot just because the handles can get in the way, at least mine did. I also opted to top stitch at 1/4 of an inch from the edge using a 3.5 millimeter stitch length. You'll also want to go really slow over the side seams. I ended up hand cranking over the side seam just to make sure that my stitches were set and I didn't break a needle. You can add an additional row of top stitching 1/8 away from your original stitch line if you'd like to, just again making sure that you push the handles out of the way. Now we're going to prep our drawstring cord. I am using this softer rope type cord, so I'm going to use a safety pin by attaching it to one end of each of my pieces of rope. Now you're going to take your first piece of rope and using the safety pin, you're going to feed it into the channel, starting from the left side, working your way towards the right side of this first channel. Once you're all the way through the first channel, you're going to continue into the second channel until you're all the way out back where you started. Once you're through both channels with your first piece of rope, you're going to even out the ends and then tie it into a knot. Now you're going to take your drawstring, starting from the right side this time, and use that safety pin to push it through the channels, similar to how we did the first drawstring. I'm using my fingers to kind of push the first drawstring up so that this second drawstring fits directly underneath it. Now you're going to even out this drawstring and tie it in a knot. Now that the drawstring is done, give it a little pull, see how it closes and opens because your bag is now done. Up next, we're going to be working on the notion pouch. Now working on the notion pouch, you're going to use the pouch template G as a guide and mark all of the snap positions. You're then going to interface the top and bottom snap spots. Once interfaced, you're going to put these right sides together. You're going to clip all of the edges together other than the short bottom edge. You're going to fold back the bottom straight edge on both pieces of fabric so that it's wrong side together. You're going to press this. I'm just using clips. You're going to do this to both sides. Now you're going to stitch all the way around, making sure to leave that bottom edge open. Stitch this at 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure you backstitch every time you start and stop. Take the curve nice and slow just to make sure that you're even. Trim the seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. I'm using pinking shears. I just find them super helpful, especially with the rounded corners. Now you're going to reach inside the opening and pull this right side out. If you need to, use a tool and push out those rounded edges. You can just use your thumb and your forefinger, but I find a tool to be more helpful. Now you're going to close up this bottom edge and clip before top stitching all the way around the entire notion pouch. Just a note for the way that I top stitched my notion pouch, I did not want to top stitch on the leather, so I just top stitched the rectangle portion of my notion pouch. Make sure you stitch that bottom edge as well. You're going to top stitch this at 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Again, I am not top stitching the flap for the snap portion. I'm just top stitching this rectangle portion. You'll continue on around the curves, but I'm opting not to do that. You're going to punch a hole at the point that we marked at the curved flap end and use that as a guide for where you're going to set the snaps. You're going to take the bottom edge and fold it upward. Then fold the flap down over the front and mark the position for the bottom half of the snap. Just as a note, I wanted a little bit of white to peek through when you're looking directly at my Notion pouch, so that's why my Notion pouch looks like this. Set both of your snaps in place and then double check that you're liking how it's closing, and then take it over and stitch it. Stitch both of the side seams, carefully stitching over the top stitching that we had done over that pressed edge. You'll want to go slow at the beginning and at the end because there's quite a bit of bulk in those sections. That completes the Notion pouch, which means we get to add this to our bag. Congratulations, you just finished the Crafter's Carry-All Tote by Kandou Crafts. Again, this is my very first YouTube tutorial. So if you enjoyed it, please give me a like or a subscribe or leave me some comments and let me know. If you have any tips, tricks, or recommendations or things you want to see from my YouTube in the future, also let me know. Can't wait to make more bags with you.